Okay. So as I was saying, chapter 22 is kind of an intro, gives you some background information. I'm going to introduce you to, guys, Charles Darwin, talk about his theory of natural selection, talk about different evidences of evolution, and that'll set us up for the next chapter, which is chapter 23, which goes into a little bit more depth about natural selection. All right, so early on, 1800s, there were some beliefs at the time amongst the scientific community. So Earth is just a few thousand years old. It's populated by forms of life that have been here unchanged since the beginning of the Earth. And at this time, many scientists were studying about the history of the Earth, organisms on the Earth, change in organisms over time, and so on. And so there are a couple of scientists that I want you to be familiar about. The first one is Lyell. He stated that geologic processes have shaped the planet and are ongoing. So the present is key to the past, looking at what's happening now, that those things were probably still happening many years ago. What do we mean by geologic processes, do you think? Lucas? The continent shifting, tectonic plates, all right, which then could change the shape of the Earth even when they collide, formations of mountains and all different types of things. So the Earth itself is in a state that is changing, all right, so that the Earth doesn't stay the same. And then organisms, looking at how organisms change in time, so that over time. There's a scientist by the name of Lamarck that was studying acquired traits. He proposed, this was his theory as far as how organisms or how populations get certain traits. He did believe in evolution, meaning that populations change over time. It's just that his mechanism of how they changed over time was flawed. And this mechanism is this idea of acquired traits. Acquired, if you acquire something, you get something within your lifetime. So, for instance, Lamarck hypothesized about giraffes. Giraffes, in the fossil record, there were shows that giraffes some giraffes had shorter necks and some had longer necks. Now most of them all of them have longer necks. And so Lamarck tried to hypothesize about how the longer necks in the giraffe became the prevalent trait. And so his theory was of acquired traits, that the giraffes got those traits within their lifetime. And this is what he thought, and this is one of his most famous examples about that, is that the giraffes eat leaves high on a tree. The shorter necked giraffes couldn't get to the leaves, so they had to stretch their neck to try and get the leaves, and their necks stretched, and then their necks became longer, so they acquired or got a trait in their lifetime. And then his hypothesis was then that when those giraffes had kids, those kids now had longer necks, and so on and so forth, and that's how giraffes got longer necks. All right? This, I want to point out, this is false. Okay? This is false. All right? So what he was missing is the idea that you have to change your genes. It's your genes that you're passing on to your next generation, and those are what they're giving traits to your kids. You cannot give those traits that you acquire in your lifetime. Kind of like today's terms would be if somebody had plastic surgery and changed their nose, the idea that they would pass that nose on to their kids. That's not going to happen, okay? Because that same nose structure is still in their genes to pass on to their kids.
Even then, didn't they know about like vertebra and like how the neck actually like works? Like how would you, because giraffes have the same number of vertebrae in their necks as we do. Like how does that is like Laffy Taffy? Is that what they thought it was like?
I don't know. I was not around to talk to Lamarck, so I'm not sure. All right. And then Cuvier, he studied fossils. So he looked at the fossil record and began piecing together kind of organisms from the past to the present. And in studying fossils, he established that extinction does occur because you see fossils of certain organisms that aren't alive today, that there's no record of ever seeing them alive today, and so therefore the conclusion is that those organisms were at once alive and now they're not, so therefore they're extinct. All right, and so all of these things kind of played a role in eventually Charles Darwin, who you probably, though hopefully you've heard of him. All right, so Charles Darwin has, yeah, you're testing. And so Charles Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later chapter. So his theory of evolution, he talked about how the earth is more than a few thousand years old, that it's populated by forms of life that do change over time, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit, and that some forms have become extinct, and we can tell this, the changing over time and the extinction and so on, by the fossil records and some dating of fossils and so on. And so his theory of natural selection is still stands in the scientific community, his theory of natural selection. And in science, a theory is something that has to have great data and great proof of. All right, so the word theory in science is different than layman's terms of theory. So there's not anything that has disproved this theory of natural selection. So let's look at the natural selection as the mechanism that Darwin explained about how populations change over time. So this definition of evolution is a change in the gene pool of a population. So what is a gene pool? It's the total groups of genes in a population. So take all the individuals and look at what their combinations of genes are. Let me talk for a minute about what a population is. A population are organisms that belong in the same species. So in Clarkston, we could be a population of humans, and in Iceland, there's another population of humans. All right, so we're the same species, but live in different areas. We could have a population of squirrels in a forest here in Clarkston, another population of the same species of squirrels in a forest in the UP. So then the gene pool would be, if you're looking at a particular trait, some individuals would be big R, some of them are big R, little r, some individuals might be little r, and so on. And so this collectively, all the genes for that particular trait of everybody in the population is called the gene pool. And what happens is that when it says evolution is a change in the gene pool, what that means, if you see here, there's 6 individuals, there's fewer big R's in the population than there are little r's, all right? So the percentage of genes is higher for little r's than big R's. A change in the gene pool would mean that over time, this population, maybe the big R's helped with survival in some way, and the big R individuals survived and reproduced, and these guys didn't, and so therefore over time, there may be more individuals that have the big R than the little r. And that's a change in gene pool, all right? So that's what that means over time. All right, so let's look at the basic idea of natural selection, kind of the thought process. So, principles of natural selection. The first one is within any population, there's genetic diversity. So it's really hard for a population to change if everybody's exactly the same, all right? Because then if the environment changes, everybody will react the same to the environment. So there's genetic diversity. This could be physical genetic diversity or molecular inside, all right? So you make certain proteins or certain genes that turn on other genes that allow certain traits to happen that you don't see. So it could be physical or not physical.
What about, for instance, like plants that are bananas or one of these things where they don't have seeds in them anymore, or the seeds are infertile, so they actually just take a piece of the plant, plant it, and it's a clone of it. So there's actually no real difference.
And that's due to us.
That's due to us. Okay, so
yes.
But there would be no genetic diversity in that, or would it be?
Well, they probably have genetic diversity in different ones that they've.
But they're all the same. They're all the same species.
Right.
Okay.
So, but yes, they're all the same species. But they wouldn't be able to, unless we interact to make new traits in them. You're right, that they would.
Okay.
So then if something were to happen, like they could.
Like
yes,
a fungus that's
yes,
happened.
Yes, yes, all right, so, but that's probably wouldn't have happened in nature.
Okay, yeah.
All right, so it has to do with
So
us.
within a natural population.
Right,
Okay.
yes, within a natural population, absolutely. All right, then the second thing is that all individuals in a population, they have to compete. So all populations live in an environment in which they compete for resources. So that may be food, space, water, all right, and so on. And all individuals, because they have different traits, and like with any competition, there's usually a winner and a loser. And so therefore the ones that win, they usually have traits that allow them to win, all right? So they're a better fighter, or they're a faster runner, or they're, whatever it may be that allows them to be the best competitor. And so what happens is the loser generally then may possibly die and therefore not reproduce. So whatever traits those better competitors have, those are the ones that will be passed on to the next generation, because they're going to have kids, they're going to have the resource, the food, and so on, have kids, and therefore that trait becomes more prevalent in the population, and the other one becomes less and less in the population. In their environment, some individuals have a better ability to survive and reproduce than others. So that's just what I just talked about. And then those individuals that do survive and reproduce pass on their more successful traits to the next generation, whatever those traits are. And maybe the trait because it allows them to camouflage with their environment and they're not eaten by predators, or whatever it may be. The less successful individuals do not pass on their traits because they don't survive to reproductive age. And so if they don't survive to reproductive age, they can't reproduce, and they don't pass on those traits. So what happens over time is the population evolves, the gene pool changes, one trait becomes more common than the other. Does not necessarily always mean that the other trait disappears. You can just have a lower frequency of them, especially if it's a recessive trait. Remember, recessive traits can be hidden in the heterozygous individual. So even if you have a trait that's not helpful, it can kind of stick around in the population. And that's a good thing because it increases genetic diversity, and if the environment changes, then possibly those individuals might have an advantage. And so the environment, we say, selects the most quote-unquote fit organisms, and this is where the word survival of the fittest comes from. So in this case here, when we say the organism is the most fit in their environment, what are we saying? Have the traits that best allow them to survive in that particular environment. Sometimes, though, an organism can be most fit, and then if the environment changes, that organism that was once most fit can become not so fit, and another organism can become the most fit depending upon the environment. So this whole process is called natural selection. So there's a picture of giraffes here. So I had said that Lamarck, his theory of acquired traits, and his idea about the long necks in the giraffes. Can somebody raise their hand and tell me how Darwin might explain the long necks in giraffes? How would Darwin explain it? It's different than Lamarck. Max?
To survive, like, their resources they need to keep the tree branches, like the leaves on the trees, and to do that they had to have long necks, so the ones without long necks would like die off until more, like you said, the gene pool changed, and so they had long necks.
Yes, absolutely. And the key to what Max said is that at the beginning you had short and long necks. All right, so there was that variation, and that the short necks couldn't reach the food, so they died off, didn't reproduce, and the long necks did reproduce, and therefore that the long necks in this case might be the big R. So the big R becomes more popular in the population as a result of that. But the key is that variation was there to begin with. So unlike Lamarck was like, oh, we have short necks, and oh, we need long necks, so we acquire the long necks. So for evolution and natural selection to happen, the variation has to be there to begin with, all right? The organism can't get the variation as a result of the environment changing, all right? And so that variation is there to begin with, all right? So let's look at some examples of natural selection. So if the environment changes, now another organism might be the most fit. So the individuals that can survive and reproduce may change. And I want to go over the very popular example of the English peppered moth. You guys remember this example from bio? A little bit, some of you. So those of you that remember, I'm going to kind of ask you guys to come help me with this. So this moth, there were two types of moths, and this was studied during the Industrial Revolution. So they looked at pre and post-industrial revolution, and these moths hung out on tree bark, which is what this picture is showing you here. So this is the bark of the tree. This is the peppered moth. So this is its wings and its body here. So you can see why it's called peppered. It's white and it's kind of peppered with black spots. So there should be sprinkled pepper on it. And this right here, I don't know if you can see it very well, there's a dark phenotype as well. So this is the dark phenotype. So these are the two phenotypes. And so before the Industrial Revolution, you had both of these phenotypes. I'm just going to draw here. Both of these phenotypes. And so there's the peppered and there's the dark colored moths. And before the Industrial Revolution, well, first of all, let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. What happened during the Industrial Revolution? Industry. All right, so it's called industrial because we have an industry. But remember, what is it about the industry that affected these moths? Pollution. And so the soot from the factories and so on. There weren't stringent laws about pollution and so on, and so soot actually settled on things on the earth. And so before the Industrial Revolution, what happened is that, so before there was a lot of these, I'm going to put the up arrow here for the peppered moths. So there were a ton of the phenotype of the peppered moth and less of the darker moth here. So there was far and few between to find a dark moth. Does anybody remember why that is? Do you remember?
Well, if you look at the pepper moth, it kind of looks like a tree bark. At least the white one, it looks very much like if you a tree, like an oak tree, you couldn't see it. And the black one, obviously you can see it. It just looks very observant on a piece of tree.
Okay.
And compared to like there was soot on the tree, then you have the white moths that now stand out, and the black ones that are obviously blending in, as you can see.
Yes, so this is the picture of a post. Yes. All right. And the predator, why it would stand out, the predator of these guys is a bird. All right. So the birds eat these moths. They kind of fly through and pick them off of trees. And so during the pre-industrial revolution, there was actually something called lichen that grew on the trees. And lichen is a lighter color, so kind of like you can see a little bit over here. Do you see how this kind of looks like the pepper moth? It was light, as Liam said. Light, and so the pepper moths blended in. They were camouflaged better. Post the tree, this is the picture of the post, the dark tree bark, and obviously you can see that it's much harder to see the darker moss than it is the lighter moss. So what happened over time is they saw a switch in the frequency of the moth. So they saw after the soot started covering, it kind of covered and killed the lichen and darkened the trees, that these moths started going down in number, and they started to see more of the darker colored moths go up in number. And so what this is showing is a change in the population or a change in the gene pool. So one gene is becoming more popular because the environment changed, and therefore that organism has a better chance of survival in terms of, in this case, hiding from their predators. And so that's a very common example of natural selection. All right, these guys here, no question?
I was just going to ask, isn't that what happens with flowers too? Like the color of the flowers is specifically designed so it attracts certain animals to come and pollinate it.
Yes, yes.
But as like a phenotype grows, so like say if like 90% of the flowers are purple, the ones that are standing out are the ones that are not purple, and that they will then continue. So it kind of like goes in waves where most of the flowers will then become a color, and then the ones that aren't that color will stand out, and then they'll get pollinated, thus changing the.
It can happen in certain, it depends on the pollinator and what certain pollinators are very, very specific,
Okay.
like, so they won't change the color, like, that they go to. So it depends on the pollinator.
Yeah, I think you just used an example of like yellow and purple flowers and bees.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
so it
it
must
just
be that
changes.
particular, yeah. So let me go through these examples. These are 3 different ways that natural selection can happen. So notice it says directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. But what I want you to see is that they are all under the umbrella of natural selection. So these are examples of natural selection. So it's not something different. So it's not like we have natural selection and disruptive selection. So we have three different, A, B, and C. So let's talk about this. So we're looking at the phenotypes of these mice, so a population of mice. And they range from light to very dark, and shades in between. And so this is the original population where you can see that most of the individuals are that medium color, and we go fewer to the light and fewer to the dark. So then let's look at this. So natural selection means if this population is going to change, the environment changes in some way to cause the population to change in some way. All right, so directional selection. So if we look at what the dotted line is the original population, and here's the evolved population. So now, over time, due to the environment changing in some way, we now have the population, it has the same kind of shape, the curve of the population, but it's shifted over so that you have more individuals towards the darker color. And if we look here, it ends here, so we actually don't have any individuals in the lighter color. So it's shifted in one direction or the other, hence directional selection. Can somebody think of an example of something that might have happened in the environment to cause a shift like that to happen in a mouse population? What could have happened? It's not really a right answer to this, it's just thinking of an example. Leo?
The weather could have warmed up, so like it was a temperate climate and there was snowfall and then just bare ground that, you know, they would favor them equally, but if it had increased through like global warming, there would be less snow, which would favor like mouses that are ground colored.
Okay, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so then you get a lower and lower and lower frequency of the light and a higher frequency of the dark. Absolutely. And so if we look at this down arrow here, what do you think this down arrow is representing on this graph? What are they trying to show you, or why do they put that on there?
Decreasing the population on that side.
Yeah, decrease in the population on this side. Sometimes they call this a selective pressure. So we'd say that these organisms on that side, in this particular case, are selected against because they do not have traits that help with their survival in this particular environment. And these organisms here that went up in number are selected for those traits that allow them to be able to survive better. So in this case here, it's the darker colored fur for the mice that allow them to survive better. And so this is a directional selection, so this is going to the right here to the darker. It could also be that the environment changed and you get the lighter colors go up, and that would also be directional selection. So it's in one direction or the other. So then in the middle here we have disruptive selection. So in this case here, again, you can see the original population. You can see that the individuals in the medium color are selected against. So therefore they go down in number, and therefore the higher or the lighter and the darker colored the mice are selected for, and so we see two peaks on either extreme and go down in the middle, and that's called disruptive selection. And then the last one is stabilizing selection, where you can see the down arrows here, where the extremes are selected against and the middle is selected for, and so therefore we get a bell-shaped curve, but it's much skinnier and taller as a result of those middle individuals becoming more prevalent. So all of these are just types of natural selection and how a population can change due to the environment changing and changing the gene pool and the frequency. All right? And these phenotypic variations that we're looking at, like the light and the dark fur, and so on, are not directed by the environment, but remember, occur through random changes in the DNA and through new gene combinations. And that some of these phenotypic variations significantly either decrease or increase the fitness of the organism and therefore the population. Random changes in DNA, otherwise known as what? Mutations, right? And through gene combinations, what does that mean? Through new gene combinations. Crossing over, all right? So you can get new gene combinations through crossing over. You can get new gene combinations from sexual reproduction. So you get different gene combinations from mom and dad and so on and so forth. And so, and those combinations and these variations can increase the fitness. So for instance, what we've talked about with antibiotic resistant bacteria, that mutation to make them antibiotic resistant increases the fitness of bacteria if they're living in an environment with ampicillin or an antibiotic. Or decreasing the fitness of the organism. Like for instance, most of our genetic disorders that are recessive are due to mutations, and a lot of these genetic disorders decrease the fitness in the person that's born with them because they're not making certain proteins and so on, and so that would not be a good mutation. All right, so that's what it means by increase or decreasing the fitness of the organism. And when the population changes due to the environment, oftentimes we hear this word that they have adapted. So let's talk about that for a second. An adaptation is a genetic variation that is favored by selection and is manifested as a trait that provides an advantage to an organism in a particular environment. So when a population, when we say an adaptation is a genetic variation, so it's something that you have inherited or that a mutation has happened in your DNA or the organism's DNA, like in the bacteria or something like that. So it's a genetic variation, happens to be favored by natural selection. So going with that bacteria example, we have a mutation in the DNA, causes let's say the ampicillin resistant gene like in our lab. So you have an organism that now has a new trait. Now that trait in the bacteria just living around in everyday life, that resistance to the antibiotic is really not helpful. But when that bacteria goes into us and causes an infection in us, and then we take the antibiotic, we change their environment, and now that trait, that gene is very beneficial, and so therefore is favored, and so by natural selection, and so it provides an advantage for that bacteria. So then we kill off all the bacteria that don't have them, leaving behind the ones that do have the resistant gene, and it makes that organism more fit for the environment. So speaking of which, we as humans impact variation in many other species as we look at this. So let's look at current things that we do as humans to kind of change the environment and therefore change species and what's more prevalent, what traits are prevalent. So as I just said here, the antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. That gene is caused by random mutation, but because of what we do, and we as humans changing the bacteria's environment, we are causing that trait to be antibiotic resistant to become more prevalent in the bacteria population. So therefore, if we weren't changing the environment by applying ampicillin or any of our antibiotics, you'd have a few bacteria that have that resistant trait, but you'd have way more that do not. And so by killing off the ones that do not, we're making that trait become more and more common. So this is an example of us increasing the trait, and that trait is not good for us. All right, it's good for the bacteria. Another example is herbicide-resistant varieties of plants. What's an herbicide? No. It's a chemical that we put on plants to kill them, like weed killers, all right, and so on would be an example of that. And so we have found that there are certain varieties of plants that are resistant to these chemicals, these herbicides. Now, it's not because the plants go, ooh, there's this chemical, let's make something to make us, not be killed by it. So the plants are going to be killed by it. Well, how is it that now we have herbicide resistance? Somebody explain how that is? It didn't come about because of the chemical.
Well, like they probably sprayed down like on the population of plants, and the ones that were already resistant to it due to a random mutation didn't die when they reproduced.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, the key is that random mutation was present somewhere in at least one individual in the population. And so it's not that the population, because every time when I for this test, I have still people that say things like they became resistant and thinking that the plants changed in some way because of the chemical being put on it. The plants did not change in some way. If you either had the gene or you didn't, it was totally random. And so in a lot of chemicals that we use, there might not be any plants that are resistant. You kill them all, but it only takes one random mutation in one plant to be able to survive, and then they reproduce, and then pretty soon you have a whole strain of individuals, plants that are resistant to the herbicide. And the same thing kind of goes with pesticides. We've also found that there are some insects that are becoming, that are resistant to our pesticide, meaning then pesticides kill insects instead of the plants. And so if there's some random mutation in a particular insect and they don't die and then they reproduce, then pretty soon you have a whole population of insects that your chemical doesn't work with. And so one example, a pesticide called DDT, we found that some of the insects, overall the population, the majority of them were resistant, and that's due to random mutation. So we are changing kind of what traits are prevalent in insects and other plants and bacteria and so on based upon us changing their environment. All right. We also influence organisms by we as humans doing this thing called artificial selection. This is a play on words with natural selection. Natural selection is nature choosing, nature doesn't really choose, that's why I'm putting it in parentheses, quotes here, but nature choosing what traits are beneficial for the survival of the organism. So in nature, in the wild, plants and animals, populations accumulate traits that are beneficial for survival, and it's based upon the nature around them, their environment, and what's helpful for them to be able to survive in that particular environment. In artificial selection, it's we as humans, it has nothing to do with nature, we as humans saying, oh, we like this trait in this organism and this trait over here, let's breed them and try to get organisms that have all those traits in one organism that we like, all right? And so that's artificial selection, that's not necessarily traits that are helpful for the organism to survive, it's traits that we breed to accumulate that are good for us in some way. All right, so it may be that it's good for us in our food source, all right? So we might want to breed cows that produce a lot of milk with another cow that, seems to have a healthy immune system and resistant to disease, all right? And so on and so forth, and get these traits all in one organism that are helpful for us in some way. And sometimes it's not even for food, sometimes it's for fun. We breed horses to do horse races. We breed dogs to show them in shows, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily always to consume or eat as well. So this is called artificial selection, the process by which species are modified by humans, and it's usually by humans selectively breeding for certain traits. So plants and animals are chosen with the desired goal of producing offspring with specific traits that are helpful for us in some manner. And these are the traits that are deemed successful, all right, if they're chosen by humans to be passed on to the next generation. So rather than in natural selection, the successful traits help them to survive in nature and help with their survival. This has nothing to do with their survival, it has to do with what's good for us. And so we've done this with pretty much all domestic animals. So I use the horses, cats, or dogs, the example, or cats. We've also done it with plants. I'm going to use the example of the wild mustard plant. Before I forget, is this anybody's? This was left here Friday.
Maggie's.
It's Maggie's. Okay. So, she must have left it here this So the wild mustard. This is what this picture is showing you here. We, over hundreds of years, have taken the wild mustard plant. So this is what the wild mustard plant looks like. And what we have done over hundreds of years is selectively bred. So we have these wild mustard plants. They looked at the differences between the wild mustard plants and they bred them. That's how you breed a plant. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Mendel's peas, where we take the pollen from the flower, which has the sperm, fertilize the egg of another flower, get the seeds, plant the seeds, get the babies. And so what they did is they took wild mustard plants with different characteristics that they wanted to have in one plant. And they did this over and over for many years, over and over and over again. And this is how all of these plants right here came about. All right, so these plants right here are from selectively breeding certain traits, and so over time, after hundreds of years, many different generations of choosing traits and so on and so forth, we get a wide variety of plants.
Going back to like domesticated animals, how did they get like teacup dogs so big?
I don't know specifically about teacup dogs, so I'm not. There probably was a trait, like the smaller, you know, because there are probably some in that species that, you know, I don't know.
I was thinking like they took like the runs of the litter and then like.
They could. I don't know specifically like about that particular breeding. So yeah.
Okay.
There was one girl recently who did a presentation on pugs and how much of an evolutionary atrocity they are because of how much health issues they have and purely bred for like cuteness. Like apparently there's a thing that veterinarians have like nicknamed like pug disease, where the brains are too big for their heads and they get swollen and they have like induced seizures. Yeah, eyes pop out. Their backs like full of like thousands of brittle vertebrae. Their paws are basically like ingrown. What are they called? Like the weird toe thing. No, not toenails. It starts with a C. Not anyway, yeah. So and then like they have so many breeding problems that like we wonder how we've actually like made something like this.
Right, and oftentimes it happens with a lot of like purebreds is that they're related in some way, and the whole thing with the genetic diseases and recessive things that they
They're
come
inbred
together
so
and they're inbred so much that that's one of the reasons why you see so many different
Disorders.
yes within the species is because of inbreeding oftentimes.
It's like
Right. Yeah. Yes. What's sad about the little punks though?
I know.
Alright.
They're so cute.
They are.
But they
are
like
cute.
eye popping out, and then they also get cataracts a lot too.
Yeah.
That's true for like dogs with like big eyes and smush faces.
Yeah.
And the cat and like Persian cats.
So
Yes,
that's why
yes. I think it's because of the inbreeding. All right. So this process here, what we've done is by artificially selection. These are different species now, and of plants. And so the process of creating a different species is called speciation. And so Darwin thought, you know, if we can do that by artificially selecting, can nature do that by selecting certain traits and so on, and eventually speciation happen. So that's what we're going to look at next, this process of speciation. So over long periods of time, natural selection can give rise to new species. And so one way that this happens is through this process called adaptive radiation. It occurs when many new species arise from a single common ancestor. And I want to give the example of the Galapagos finches. So Darwin, if you recall, he did a lot of research on the Galapagos Islands, which are located off the coast of South America. Anybody know how the Galapagos Islands were formed? Volcanoes, very good. Underwater volcanoes that erupted and the lava hardens and you get rock. All right, so, but now it's not just rocks in the ocean, there's soil and so on. So what happens is that rock erodes and gets into small little pebbles, which then erodes and then you get sand and eventually you get soil and so on. And then now, today, there are countless enormous numbers of species that are only found on the Galapagos Islands and are not found anywhere else on the world. So, so can somebody tell me how that would happen? How do you go from this volcanic island with nothing living on it to now where you have species that live nowhere else in the world?
Somehow, some kind of migration happened, and some birds went over there, and they started like adapting to the environment on the Galapagos Island, and they just never left, they didn't have a reason to.
Okay.
Because they don't really use it.
Okay, absolutely.
I would imagine it would start like with most islands, like with plants first, like some seeds would get blown over either like by the wind or either like it was like clung to a piece of feather by a bird and it landed there and somehow was able to grow, and then that produced more plants, and then once that happened, more animals came because plants usually produce food for them, and then more and more and more.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Because it was produced by a volcano, we assume it's on board with tectonic plates or near to. So at one point, it was closer to South America. So animals, there was migration. But then once they got there, they would Galapagos Island to start moving
To
farther
move.
away, so they couldn't migrate.
So it was easier for the migration. Okay, all right, yeah. And so, so with the Galapagos finches, so you guys are correct. And these Galapagos finches, one of the main things, or he looked at a lot of different species and a lot of different traits. One trait that he looked at was beak variation, and noticing that he found a correlation between what the beaks look like and the food source that were on the islands for the finches to eat. And so these Galapagos finches are these birds, and so his hypothesis is that, as you guys just said, is that they migrated, and the nearest mainland is off the coast of South America. And so, so that when the birds migrated, there were different islands, and each of the different islands had different seeds that had blown there, and different food sources and so on. So the environment was slightly different. And so when these birds migrated, that because of the various islands had slightly, like I said, different food sources, the environment was slightly different, different traits were advantageous in different environments. And so therefore, when we say that the birds adapted, that again doesn't mean that they flew there and said, ooh, there's lots of hard seeds to open, I need to have a big old beak to do that, all right? So then they grow a big beak. That did not happen. So there was no variation to begin with in maybe beak size, and that when the food source was seeds, and therefore if you had these two, a beak like this and a bird with a beak like this, competing for the seed, this one's probably going to win because this one has a stronger beak to crack open the seeds to get inside of it and so on, where this one not so much. But then if there were a lot of insects to eat, this one would be more successful because it has a skinnier, thinner beak to get into cracks and crevices, pull insects out of like tree barks and so on, and pick them up easier, kind of like if we have something really small, we would use tweezers to pick it up instead of our bulky hands. The same kind of idea here. And so because the different islands had different environments, then different traits accumulated. And so then what happens over time is as these different traits accumulate, because this trait is more beneficial for this environment, and this trait is more beneficial for this environment, what happens over time is that even if these birds come in contact with each other again, they won't mate with one another. And that's with the beginning of the speciation process. We'll talk a little bit later that a lot of species look for specific traits in a mate. And if you change it up just a little bit, like lightning bugs look for certain blinking patterns. If you don't have that right blinking pattern, they're not mating with you. All right, so it's very, very, very specific. And so what happens is if different traits accumulate, then they come together, even if they come into contact with one another, they may not mate. They might have the ability to, and the ability to have kids, but they don't because they don't have the traits. And then what happens over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years is that they just keep accumulating differences and so on, and they become different species as a result of that. And that's the process of speciation in the Galapagos Islands. And that's called adaptive radiation from one species to multiple, all right? And then the last part of this chapter is all about, so that's an intro. We're going to talk more in chapter 23 about more about natural selection. But I want to talk a little bit about the evidences for evolution, and none of these pieces of evidence are standalone. They kind of work in conjunction with one another and support one another to kind of look at the big picture of what has happened in the past. And a big one is fossils. So fossils found in sedimentary rock, remains or traces of organisms from the past. They may or may not still exist, so it may be an extinct organism or it may be an ancestor of a current organism that still exists today. And paleontology is the study of fossils. Paleontologists study fossils, and this is an example of one fossil of a dragonfly. Here are some other examples. So dinosaur bones in sedimentary rock. A lot of fossils are formed in sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock have layers. You probably, if you remember from previous science classes, sediments pile on top of one another. If an organism dies, what happens is the bacteria eat the fleshy parts, all right? So the fleshy parts decompose. What's left is the hard parts, which is the bones. So then you have the bones, and then sediment piles on top of there. What else needs to occur for fossilization for sedimentary rock to occur? There needs to be the presence of something else. There's pressure, but there's physically has to be something else besides sediments. So we have water, all right? So you have to have water, so it's usually in a water source, so in a lake or oceans and things like that. So you get this, so it dies, all right, and the fleshy parts get eaten away by the bacteria, sediment pile on top of each other, the minerals from the water and the sediments get into the pores of the bones, harden, fossilize the bones, the sediments pile on top of each other, pressure causes it to harden into rock, and so you have these layers of sedimentary rock. And then we can find these sedimentary rock as erosion, as the rock is exposed and erosion happens, they can be exposed and people can study them. Petrified trees, another example. You can have impressions, so here's one of the leaf and footprints. Impressions, shells can harden, be fossilized. Sometimes you can get frozen fossils. So this is the woolly mammoth. Also, that I don't have a picture of here that somebody last hour brought up is tar pits. So organisms can fall into tar pits and kind of be mummified a little bit in there. Jurassic Park made amber very popular, all right? With the insects, small organisms can be fossilized there, all right? And we'll stop here.